Annapolis Mosaics. Our program spotlights people in our community who are involved in activities designed to promote good human relations. I am Michael Keller, the chair of the Annapolis Human Relations Commission and your host. The commission is a city board that seeks to promote equal opportunity and to eliminate discrimination. My guest today is Robert Clark, the president and CEO of Historic Annapolis. Bob, welcome to Annapolis. Robert, welcome to Annapolis Mosaics.
I'm glad to be here, Mike. Thanks.
Well, first, what is the mission of Historic Annapolis?
Our mission basically is to preserve and protect the built environment that exists in Annapolis, and also to connect people to the fabulous mosaic that we all enjoy. So through educational programs and tours, we fulfill that mission.
Okay. Could you tell our viewers a little bit about the history of Annapolis, Historic Annapolis? When did you get started? And what kinds of highlights have you seen over the years?
So Mike, our organization, which is a nonprofit 501c3, was born 63 years ago. And 63 years ago, Annapolis was being invaded by developers who had a keen idea that they wanted to tear down the old stuff and put in new stuff. As radical as that sounds, it includes multi-hundred-year-old homes, even includes the home of William Paca, who was one of the 4 signers from Maryland. His house had been approved for demolition. So back in those days, our founders would have laid down in front of bulldozers, literally. But now we look back at a rich, proud history. We can identify over 400 buildings that were saved by Historic Annapolis from demolition. As a result, your eyes are happy when you walk down Main Street or down Maryland Avenue or down into the other byways. And you're looking at a city that Thomas Jefferson would recognize if he were to come back today. We are advocates for preservation for sure, but we're also stewards of preservation. The state of Maryland has entrusted us with 12 historic properties in Annapolis for us to maintain, conserve, and interpret, which we do proudly.
Well, let's talk about some of those properties. Let's start with the James Bryce House. Could you tell our viewers a little bit about that?
The James Bryce House was the cornerstone in the basement. Says 1763 was when that was laid. The Bryce family were very noble and responsible and affluent people here in Annapolis. James Bryce was a mayor at one point. His home, according to Colonial Williamsburg, is one of the most outstanding examples of, in its current state of preservation, of a colonial mansion. And if you go by James Bryce House at 42 East Street, you can see how opulent it was. And this was built during the golden age of Annapolis, which was just prior to the Revolutionary War, when a number of these brick mansions were constructed.
How about Hogshead?
Hogshead is on the other end of the scale. Hogshead is on Pinckney Street, 43 Pinckney Street, and represent what a home that most of us would have lived in. And we interpret it that way. So we do lots of tours, lots of children come through, and we're open every weekend for that.
And you made reference to the William Paca House and Gardens. That's a local place that a lot of people like to visit. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
So, as I mentioned, William Paca was a lawyer. He was governor. He was also one of the 4 signers of the Declaration from Maryland. All 4 lived in Annapolis, by the way, and all 4 of their homes still exist. But the Paca House, after the Pacas moved on, took a lot of different looks. In 1900, it was turned into a hotel called Carville Hall. A 200-room hotel was built onto the Paca House and built over what we now see as the Paca Garden. That was demolished in the 1970s, and Historic Annapolis prevented the house itself from being demolished. And today we enjoy lots of tours of the garden and the house. And we interpret it as the house looked when Mr. Pecca lived there.
How about the waterfront warehouse?
Waterfront warehouse really represents that golden era that I was talking about. And what I mean by that, this was a very busy port. Tobacco being a very big cash crop. So the ships would come in here and they'd pick up the tobacco and go to Europe, and they'd bring back shiploads of fine things that the Annapolitans then would consume and sell. But maritime at that time was really the engine that kept Annapolis going.
And then you've got the historic Annapolis Museum.
Historic Annapolis Museum is at 99 Main Street. It houses our museum store on the first and part of the second floor. But the other half of the second floor and the third floor is devoted to an exhibit that we call Freedom Bound, which is the story of 9 runaways, mostly slaves, but some indentured servants as well. And we were able to develop these histories and their stories by doing research in the newspapers at that time.
You mentioned earlier that historic Annapolis bills itself as a champion of preservation advocacy. What actual initiatives has the organization taken in this area?
So a couple of things. One, we're currently underway executing a series of public forums called What's Your View? Okay. We had our first one in September. We have our next 2 coming up in December. What basically is we invite members of the public, elected officials and others to come in to discuss the future of the city dock and the downtown built environment. In terms of other activities, we partner with the Historic Preservation Commission, which, is, as you know, is the enforcement arm of the city, and help consult and advise them on preservation matters.
And you mentioned the Historic Preservation Commission in the city of Annapolis, and I suspect that a lot of our viewers are going to be saying, well, what's the difference between Historic Annapolis and the Historic Preservation Commission? In fact, many of our viewers probably see the two as being about the same, but of course they're very different.
They are different. As I mentioned, the HPC is a commission of the city, and it is the enforcement arm. Right. They enforce the ordinances and laws that are on the books. Right. We are a nonprofit where we do educational things and remain advocates for preservation.
Okay. I'm sure once again, some of our viewers are going to be thinking about historic Annapolis and all of the wonderful charm that the city has with its historical heritage. But I'm sure that there's going to be a lot of viewers who are going to say, well, this is really just for the tourists. This is not something that really can benefit average residents of the city. But in reality, Historic Annapolis does have a number of educational programs that can be used by our residents and can benefit from them. Is that indeed the case?
Mike, that's absolutely the case. We're in schools. We do a lot of work with the Title I schools. We have schools come visit us, and a large part of the things we focus on is that. Now, we do have events that would slip into the category of more fun than educational. We have 3 major events in that category. We have the Pecca Girlfriends annual Flower Power Party, which is in June. 600 ladies dressed in their finest come out and spend an evening in the Pecca Garden. We have lots of vendors there, girlish things. And they party hardy for 4 or 5 hours. That event sells out in about 3 or 4 hours. In September, we have an equivalent event called Blazers, Bourbon, and Cigars, which, as you might guess, is for gentlemen. And this past September was our 2nd year. We had over 400 gentlemen show up and did what the name of the event says. They had some bourbon, they wore their blazers, and there were some cigars spotted in the garden. Our other big event just happened this past weekend called Annapolis by Candlelight. This is where each year we have between 2,000 and 3,000 people tour 10 or 12 historic homes. They don't all have to be colonial mansions, although they frequently are. We have lots of people who are interested in history. We have lots of people interested in architecture. And then we have lots of people who are interested in looking at other people's stuff. So we have, I say, around 2,500 people buy tickets for that tour. It's Friday and Saturday night. And this year was no exception. We had a great turnout, had good weather, and a lot of people had fun.
Robert, does Historic Annapolis have programs that are geared toward kids and families?
Well, we do. We have a program called Mr. Peka's Backyard, which is largely for pre-kindergarten kids. And it sells out every time we do it. Moms love events where they can bring their children and go out in Mr. Peka's backyard, the Peka Garden, and have a number of events that they participate in.
Well, we're going to take a break now, but when we return, I'll be talking with Robert Clark about additional items of interest about Historic Annapolis. Very good.
And you dance?
We're talking today with Robert Clark, the president and CEO of Historic Annapolis. You'd mentioned earlier, Robert, that the exhibit at the Historic Annapolis Museum is indeed freedom-bound, the runaways of the Chesapeake, and you made just a brief description of it. Could you provide our viewers with a little bit more detail? I think some of our listeners today would probably be really interested in knowing why you chose this for a topic, and some detail about what actually the exhibit includes.
So the current exhibit followed a living history event called Project Runaway. And this is where we had actors and actresses depict the runaways. One of the runaways ran off to Ireland and stayed there. Another one enlisted in the British Navy. A number of the runaways were slaves, and they were just anxious to be reunited with their families, which slavery sometimes separated families. So that's a lot of it. But we had the history available to us, and we were able to track what happened after they ran away and what they did for the rest of their lives. Freedom Bound basically tells a little bit of that story. We have videos, we have audio, so you can sort of understand character by character, all 9 stories. And it's rich. It's very rich history.
And you're planning an exhibit which is entitled A History of Annapolis in 99 Objects. What is that going to entail?
Well, we are. The British Museum wrote a book and did an exhibit called The History of the World in 100 Objects. Richard Curran, Dr. Richard Curran, he wrote a book called The History of America in 101 Objects. So we decided we were going to try to tell a history of Annapolis in 100 objects. Our curator said, well, wait a minute, our museum is at 99 Main Street. Why don't we define the address and the exhibit by saying we're going to tell a history of Annapolis in 99 objects. So about 18 months ago, that idea was born. Shortly after that, I had an occasion to visit the Maryland Conservation and Archaeology Laboratory down in South County. And Nicole took me around on a tour, and when we're all done, she said, would you like to see our storeroom? And I said, well, sure. So we went in, and I looked around. It looks like a storeroom, except there was something over in the corner I couldn't quite get my brain around. So I went over and I looked more carefully. And I'm staring at it, and I said, Nicole, I don't know what I'm looking at. She said, Robert, that was the acorn that was put on top of the State House in the 1700s when it was built. Then she said the words I'll never forget. She said, would you like to see an x-ray of what's under the paint? Because the dome was wooden, it was filled with wood shims, covered by copper, covered by paint. So I said, well, if you're asking, I need to see it. So she brings me this x-ray, and Mike, it showed the signatures of the men who built the State House. So my mind flooded with all sorts of things at that moment, and I'm thinking, Annapolis has more 18th century homes and buildings than any other city in the nation. And I thought, I bet you some of their homes still exist. And that's when I stopped and thought, 98 more to go. And shortly after that, I was in Baltimore telling the story to one of my colleagues over there, and he said, would you like to see my storeroom? So he took me down, and he introduced me to Robert Eden's sedan chair. Robert Eden was the last British governor in Annapolis before he went back to England. He left June 26, 1776, 1 week before Independence Day. He left hastily and left his sedan chair, which still exists in Baltimore. That's when I realized 97 more to go.
And you've actually solicited, I think, with the public in terms of having people nominate objects that will be one of the 99.
We have, and we've gotten thousands of nominations. The Smithsonian alone nominated 2,800 items. So a rich history of Annapolis spans 4 centuries. So it's not just colonial history. It's going to be clay pipes from Providence. It's going to be a menu from the Little Campus Inn. It's going to be artifacts from Carville Hall. It's going to be Roger Staubach's helmet. It's going to be Marion Warren's camera, and on and on and on. Plus, the other museum venues in town are partnering with us. So the State House, as an example, has George Washington's original resignation speech. They're never going to give it up. So you would go over there to see that.
Okay, all right. What would you describe as the greatest accomplishments of historic Annapolis over the years, and why?
Well, those of us who live and work in Annapolis feel that we enjoy an extraordinary high quality of life. And I think historic Annapolis has contributed to that over the decades. I think that if you were to ask that same question of people who visit here or people who have lived here and moved away, I think they would speak to the high quality of life. I think they would speak to the human dimension of Annapolis. Horses, remember? And so, as I mentioned earlier, George Washington and Thomas Jefferson would recognize Annapolis. You can point to other cities that tore all the old stuff down and built up the new stuff. I don't want to name them, but you know where they are. And some of them are close to here. And it looks different when you have, when you don't have that human dimension in the architecture.
Historic Annapolis has incredible array of programs and activities. Obviously, that kind of work can't be done by a very small number of people. Do you make use of volunteers in any form of capacity?
We do.
And how can volunteers be used? How do you use volunteers? What kind of roles do they play?
Thank you for asking. We have about 30 employees at Historic Annapolis, half of them being part-time and half of them being full-time. They work long hours and produce a great product. We use about 600 volunteers to supplement them. For instance, the candlelight tour that I just mentioned took 400 volunteers. We had to have one in every room of every house that people tour, not only to answer questions, but obviously for security. Anybody who has an interest in volunteering, I would ask to contact me directly. And you can do that through our website, annapolis.org, O-R-G, and which goes into more detail about volunteer opportunities at many different levels.
And given the amount of staffing that you have and the work that you do, obviously takes funding. Where do you derive the largest amount of your revenues from? How do you find it?
So a combination of things. We get about 30% of our annual budget from the state, which is directed to maintaining, conserving, and interpreting their buildings. The other 2/3 comes from a combination of donations, events that I mentioned, admissions, and fees that we get from putting on tours. That's the biggest source of our income.
Historic Annapolis also partners with a large number of organizations, and you've made some reference to it during our conversation this morning, and you have something called a Heritage Partners Program. Could you share a little bit about what that is with our viewers?
So we're part of the Four Rivers Heritage Area here in Annapolis. There are a number of heritage areas throughout the state, and the other partners in this heritage area would include the Charles Carroll House, the Hammond Harwood House, the Maritime Museum, London Town Museum, and so on. So we're part of that. We all partner on various projects, but the Four Rivers Heritage Area is the one we're in.
You made reference earlier to something I think quite poignant, and you said that if individuals who lived in Annapolis back during colonial times were to come back today, that they would recognize much of what the city is. They would be shocked by the technology. They would be astounded by the social developments. But you can sense that they would be pleased that much of the architecture that was part of Annapolis when they were here, they would say, there's these buildings that are still in place and people are still enjoying them. What do you think the people of the colonial era would be most proud of in terms of what Historic Annapolis has done? And specifically, what landmarks do you think they would be most pleased to find that they're still accessible and available to the public?
So my dad, who turns 98 next month, could answer that question better because he grew up near here and speaks warmly and fondly about his experiences then. And when he comes back, I can just see him beam because it's a flashback in time for him. And it would be for the colonists who lived here then, when Annapolis was getting started. It was sort of an accident. Baltimore was discovered, its harbor was discovered right after the Revolutionary War. And almost overnight, everybody who could left. Maritime, as I mentioned earlier, was a big part of our history. Baltimore having a superior port was going to take away the Annapolis business, which it did. Everybody associated with maritime left and went to Baltimore. The only people that stayed were the people who couldn't leave. They moved into the existing housing stock. They were too poor to tear it all down as they did in Philadelphia, New York, and Boston. So it stayed and bumped along until the Naval Academy got here in the mid-1800s. Still was the state capital, but it wasn't until the 1950s until developers discovered Annapolis to come in and to start tearing things down. That's when Historic Annapolis was born, and that's why the Annapolis today looks like it did 250 years ago.
We've talked a little bit about looking back in the past. Let's look ahead in the future. What would be your vision of what Historic Annapolis should look like, say, in 5 years? What things would you like to see the organization do over the next 5 years? What's your vision for the organization over that period of time, Robert?
Historic Annapolis is not a group of naysayers. We are not opposed to change. We're opposed to modifying existing ordinances that evolve for a really good reason, mainly height and bulk ordinances. So as long as those are not violated, we're pro-development. We're happy to see new things happen. The Historic Preservation Commission would have strong views on things being torn down in total. But I think the way the city has evolved makes everybody happy, and I think we'd like to see that continue.
And what, of all of the different historic buildings and exhibits that you have throughout this community, what's the one that touches your heart the most? if you have to pick out one or two that really touch your heart and you say, this is something that if a visitor comes to Annapolis, you really want them to see these things.
I think the answer would have to be the State House.
Why?
The State House is rich in history and in architecture. And they recently restored Old Senate Chamber. Brings tears to your eyes. The state did a majestic job of its restoration. It's historically accurate in every possible way. And I would recommend any visitor who wants to have a lasting impression of Annapolis to visit the State House.
And you know, that is the oldest working state house, I believe, in the United States.
That's what we're told.
And those legislators who served in the colonial legislature, not just the legislature that was created after independence, but the colonial legislature would recognize it just as they do today. You know, I remember a statement made by former Mayor Dick Hillman, and he was responding to concerns that residents had about the number of tourists swarming around the city, for which I think Annapolitans have a love-hate relationship. And Mayor Hillman said, I'd rather live in a place where people want to come to than a place that no one wants to come to. And you know, I would say that because of the work and contributions and diligence that historic Annapolis has demonstrated over the years, Robert, I think it has allowed Annapolis to continue to be a place where people want to come to.
I would agree. If you bump into somebody in New York City from Crofton, Millersville, Arnold, or such, and you ask them where they live, they say Annapolis. It's a pride that we all enjoy, and we love showing off our city.
Thank you for viewing our program today, and please join us again on Annapolis Mosaics. If you would like more information about the Annapolis Human Relations Commission, please jot down the information on your screen. You can reach us at 410-263-7998 or by email at hrcommission@annapolis.gov. And check out our page at the City of Annapolis website. Go to www.annapolis.gov, click on City Government, then Boards and Commissions, and you can scroll down to the Human Relations Commission page. And always remember the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who said, "We have flown the air like birds and swum the seas like fishes, but have yet to learn the simple act of walking the earth as brothers and sisters." Thank you, Robert.
Thank you, Mike.
This is very informative.